Hello and welcome to the Name Stories podcast, where we discuss issues related to our research into names and naming in adoption. Today we will be speaking to Dr. Jane Pilcher, the principal investigator on the Name Stories project. So good morning, Jane. Could you just introduce yourself to the listeners, please, and say a bit more about your work on names and naming?
Hello, I'm Jane Pilcher. I'm Associate Professor of Sociology at Nottingham Trent University. And one of the things I study is people's names and what that kind of matters for in terms of their identities and how they feel about themselves and their families and other aspects of who they are.
So how are names and identity linked?
Names and identities are linked in all sorts of ways. When you start thinking about it, your mind just explodes with all the potential possibilities. So names matter, for example, in terms of your own individual kind of what I call socio-legal or socio-administrative identity, all the things that have got your name on it that tell administrators and people in companies and organisations that you work with or you belong to who you are. So It's kind of like your individual legal kind of identity. The sort of things you have to fill in forms. You always have to put your name, and that kind of generates your kind of socio-administrative legal identity. So there's that level of identity, a paper, on paper, if you like. But I'm more interested in names in terms of what it tells us about people's social identities. So by that I mean who they belong to at a family level or a kinship level, but also who they belong to in terms of other cultural groups like ethnicity, social class, gender, and names are an important interest of mine, but also things like how old you are. So we never think really perhaps about how our first names, like my name Jane, almost kind of indicates how old you are, because names go in and out of popularity over time. So someone called Jane most likely nowadays is someone like me, a woman, middle-aged woman born in the 1960s when Jane was a very popular name. Whereas nowadays very few children have the name Jane because it's just not a popular name. So all those kinds of ways, I think names are linked to who we are, and they kind of signal to other people who we are in terms of belongings in society.
Yeah, who we are and where we've come from, and place, I suppose you're saying there. Place and time absolutely. As well.
Place and time, absolutely. You can locate people in place and time and in other sorts of ways socially once you know their name.
Right, okay. And at the moment you're working on a project to do with names and adoption. So can you tell us a bit more about that and where the idea for the project came from?
I was interested in how things around names are potentially more challenging for people in adoptive families than for other families. So parents get to choose names for their children. We all, we see these baby name books and these baby name lists, and, everyone wants to know what you're going to call your baby when it's born. So it's a kind of big rite of passage. But clearly for people who have children in adoptive families, that child has already been named once in their life by their birth parents. So I was interested in that kind of place in adoptive families where what do you do with a child's name when that child has already been given a name by their birth parents? But not only the first names, I think, are of interest for looking at adoptive family experiences, but also what happens to surnames. So you take a child into your family, you adopt a child, and most often that child's surname will also change, kind of like automatically as a consequence of belonging to that new family. So I was interested in how that makes parents feel when they adopt a child, but also how when a child has grown up and become an adult as an adoptee, how do they feel about those kinds of changes that have been made to their names? So that's where I was coming from. I was interested in it in terms of feelings of belonging within families and adoptees' identities and how names play a part in how they feel about their identity as an adopted person.
Right, well, it's a very complex area, but names are obviously key in that research. Excellent. So who's going to be taking part in this research?
Our study has been particularly interested in the experiences of adults who were adopted when they were children. we've started recruiting over these last few months, and we've already had a lot of interest from adults who were adopted in the 1950s and 1960s. We're currently really looking now to recruit participants who are a bit younger, so participants who were adopted in the 80s and 90s. We'd like to get more participants of that kind of age range. So that's one group of our participants. The other group of participants are people who have adopted a child at any point, and however old that child now is. So we're looking at both the experiences of adoptees who are adults now and adopters who may have very recently adopted a child, or they might have adopted a child in the 1970s or 80s or even 1960s.
Right. And part of the research is I could see that you're asking people to talk about their name stories. So can you just tell us what is a name story?
Well, firstly, I think it's important to say what it's not, or what we shouldn't think of name stories in terms of. So it's not that these are untrue things, completely made up stories, products of people's imaginations. So it's not kind of like a tall tale, but it is about people's kind of perception of their experiences. That's what we want to capture. So in sociology, there's a kind of way of thinking that we all tell stories. It's how we make sense of our own identities. It's how we relate to people. It's how we make sense of the social worlds that surround us. So we're all storytellers. We're sitting in a coffee shop with our friends and we say, oh, I must tell you of something that happened to me last week. That's telling a story. So it's stories in that sense. It's how we talk about our lives and how we tell people about our lives. So simply speaking, we want to capture people's experiences of names in the ways it's affected their adoptive family lives. So it's just capturing their feelings and experiences about names in their adoptive experiences.
Right, excellent. And what do you hope will come from this particular research that you're doing?
Well, we've already been blown away, I think, by the amount of interest that we've had, particularly from people who've been adopted. And many of them have thanked us for kind of giving them a voice or allowing their voice to be heard, allowing them to share their experiences. So that's already a kind of important function of our project. And that was indeed one of the things I hoped that would happen. We would capture the voices of people who perhaps haven't had the opportunity to tell their experiences, to share what's happened to them and how they feel about it. So there's that kind of output, but we also hope that the findings that we uncover, these experiences from people affected by adoption, will feed forward into future policy and practice, so that those social work professionals, for example, or adoption practitioners who are advising adoptive parents, for example, about what to do with the names of their adopted children, can take into account the findings that we have about people's experiences and how people feel about names in their adoptive journeys.
Okay, thank you. And if people do want to get in touch with this research, how can they do that?
We have a project website called adoptionstories.org.uk. So people interested in this project, finding out about more or taking part, can go there and read all about us, see the pictures of us who are involved in this project, and find some other sort of resources and information around adoption and names. So that's the best place for people to go, adoptionstories.org.uk.
Okay, great. And that's for people that have been adopted and for people who have adopted children.
Absolutely, for people who are adopted themselves, or for people who are adopters, or for people who are just interested in the project more generally. There's going to be a gradual kind of build up of content, build up of resources that we hope people will find interesting, and eventually we'll be sharing some of our findings through that project, through that website as well.
Great. It sounds very exciting.
It's been fascinating for me, and I've been blown away by the amount of interest in this project. It's really been, a great experience so far. And the thing that's made the difference for me is how well people have responded to it and how people have thanked us for doing the project, which is great.
Yeah, real positive feedback there. Great. Thank you so much, Jane. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Come back and hear another Name Stories podcast soon.